after the Jefferson Day dinner, the vice president of the United States obviously was at odds with Andrew Jackson. John C. Calhoun just couldn't stand him anyway. And after that dinner, he resigned and thought he could, have more use by going back and being a senator in South Carolina and, pointing them in the right direction, according to him, which was to push for nullification. Now, remember, a nullification not only meant nullifying the hated tariff, but also meant nullifying any law that would outlaw slavery. And that was a big thing for South Carolina. That was a big thing, obviously, for John C. Calhoun. But once he got back into South Carolina, it began to be even more contentious. As South Carolina, the state legislature there declared the existing tariff to be null and void within South Carolina. So understand what they just did right there by doing that. They went against the Constitution. They went against the President of the United States. They went against the Supreme Court. It was a bold move on South Carolina's part, for sure, and could have immediately erupted into civil war. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed. But they even said they started building up their militia in preparation for a civil war because they knew that Jackson would be upset. They knew that they were going against the Constitution and the Supreme Court. So President Jackson then privately threatened to hang the nullifiers. I mean, he publicly he wasn't as bold, but privately he was just furious with South Carolina and his former vice president. He took this as attack on him, and he didn't like people undermining his authority, even though, keep in mind, Jackson was from a southern state of Tennessee and he was a slave owner, but his position as president to him was more important. The man who stepped in once again for the second time was Henry Clay. Henry Clay goes down in history. His nickname is the Great Compromiser, and you can see why. He was the author of the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise that fended off war. He's going to do it again here. He's going to, I guess I could say, save the day by coming up with this compromise tariff in 1833. It began to be like, pardon my language, but a pissing match between Calhoun and Jackson for power. And Henry Clay stepped in and he created a bill that would gradually reduce the tariff about 10% over a period of 8 years, which would, in his mind, and a lot of people who supported it, allow the infant industries to grow up and become parent industries, I guess you could say, or adult industries. They would get stronger and the tariff would protect them and it would gradually go down. So it might give those industries incentive to get better and be able to charge cheaper prices so that they can compete with foreign products. And South Carolina accepted it because if no other state came to their aid, you would think some of the other southern states would come to their aid, but they did not. So anyways, as to save face, they accepted the compromise tariff of 1833. Reluctantly, Jackson accepted it because he really wanted to get back at John C. Calhoun and send the military in to stop them from doing this. So because he was a general and that was his first instincts. So South Carolina then accordingly repealed their ordinance of nullification, said we're not going to do that, and they accepted the compromise tariff of 1833. But one more kind of, I guess, Calhoun wanting to get the last word in, he nullified what's called the Force Bill. Jackson had signed the Force Bill, which would force states to pay the tariff, and if they didn't, would that state would be subject to attack by the military. It was called the Force Bill, and South Carolina hated it, so they repealed their ordinance of nullification, but they nullified the unnecessary Force Bill. So they used nullification again, even after they said they wouldn't. But it's just a pissing match back and forth between these two. Here's a political cartoon right here that really depicts Calhoun. This is definitely a negative for Calhoun. It says here, this contemporary cartoon shows Calhoun reaching for the power over the dead bodies of the Constitution and the Union. Jackson at the far right threatens to hang the nullifiers. So it says here, nullification, South Carolina ordinance, treason, civil war, deception, disunion, and despotism at the very top up here. So they're saying that's what Calhoun is after, a dictatorship. Okay, let's switch over and talk about the bank issue. A big incident under the Jackson administration was the National Bank. From what you know about Jackson, he being a believer in states' rights, with the exception of not supporting the doctrine of nullification, he hated the National Bank. He thought it was something for the rich people only, that it benefited the rich and it didn't benefit the common man. And understand that Jackson wasn't, should we say, very educated. He didn't believe in education. We've talked about that before also. So in Jackson's mind, he wanted to destroy the National Bank. Now, just a quick reminder of the history of the National Bank. It was started in 1791 by Hamilton's bill, and it had a 20-year charter. In 1811, it was up, but was not rechartered because of the War of 1812, and they just kind of went by the wayside. And then the American System by Henry Clay. Henry Clay came in, here's his name again, and he created the American System, and one of them was the Second National Bank, and it passed in 1816 and had a 20-year charter. Well, this charter was up in 1836. And Jackson was like not a big believer in it, but wasn't really doing much. And then along comes Henry Clay. I think I mentioned that Henry Clay quite possibly wanted to be president more than anyone in history. And Henry Clay knew that he was up against a tough opponent in Jackson in the 1832 election. So Henry Clay was running in that 1832 election and knew that, hey, I got no chance to win. Here's my one chance to back the president, Jackson, into a corner, and by creating re-upping the National Bank, creating a bill. He went to Nicholas Biddle, who was the president of the National Bank, and he said, please draw up a second charter that would be an extension, a 20-year charter. It is up in 1836. It is 1832. But he's saying we want to re-up it so we don't even have to worry about it in 1836. And he knew that Jackson hates this bank. So it was a ploy by Clay to win the election of 1832. So what he did was he said, I'm gonna have them pass this bill. It'll get to the president's desk, and the president either has to sign it into law or veto it. And knowing that Jackson was just an outspoken hater of the National Bank, and he knew that Jackson would probably veto it. And if Jackson vetoes the National Bank, the rich people will turn on him because the rich people know that the National Bank is necessary. So he says, I'll win it that way. He'll screw up by vetoing the National Bank. And then if he does decide, let's say Jackson says, I'm not going to piss off the rich people and I'm going to sign it into law. In Henry Clay's mind, then he would go to the common man and say, look, your president, who's supposed to be for you and the common man, and talks bad about the bank, turns around and signs it into law just so he could appease the rich people. And then in Henry Clay's mind again, he thought, well, the people, the common man, will vote for him as president and he would win. So really what he's trying to do is put the president in a catch-22 situation. A catch-22 situation is a situation that you can't win no matter what. You're wrong either way. And it was a ploy, no doubt. Well, the Biddle creates the bill. It goes through the House, it goes through the Senate, and it gets to the president's desk. And from what you know about Andrew Jackson, he's not going to go against his principles. He vetoes the National Bank bill. Not only that, but he also attaches a long letter and sends it to all the newspapers throughout the country explaining why he vetoed the National Bank and that it was a tool for the rich people and not the common man. So when it came to the election, this is about his veto, when it comes to the election, Andrew Jackson wins by another landslide, 77% of the electoral vote. He wins by a landslide because the common man came out in droves and voted for him to win the presidency in 1832. And Henry Clay loses for a second time. You know, he lost in 1824. Now he loses in 1832, and he's not happy about that. And it just, you know, there's a lot of deception a lot of deception that in the two, one he made the corrupt bargain in 1824, and then this one trying to force his bank bill through. So Henry Clay is going to try one more time in 1844, and he's going to fail there too. He's going to be a 3-time loser for the presidency. But Andrew Jackson wins a second term. And then by winning the election, he takes it as a mandate, which is permission from the public that I'm going to kill the national bank. He made it his goal to kill the national bank. He didn't put any money into it and paid every bill that the country had and took money out of the national bank until it was dead. He put all money coming in into state banks. They were called pet banks. And he spread this money throughout the states. Again, a firm believer in states' rights. He said the states will benefit from this government money, and the states will be stronger because of it. That was his philosophy. Well, what happened is the states were the beneficiary of all this money coming in. And what banks do with money is they loan it out to the public. Public could come and get loans from these pet banks. And back then, you got a loan for one reason and one reason only, and that was to buy property. You didn't have cars back then, so you get a loan to buy property. So people were going and borrowing money. And money was, as we call it, cheap, like it is right now. Cheap money, low interest rate. So it made sense for people to borrow money and go buy land and start making a profit. That's how you make something of yourself. Right, back then, you have a farm, you start growing crops, and you make money, and then you easily pay back your loan. And it was cheap money anyway because of the pet banks and the competition amongst the pet banks for borrowers. So what this created is land fever. Everybody wanted to buy land. Money became almost worthless because of inflation. If everybody has money in their pocket, the price of goods goes up. And this land fever and the price going crazy was troublesome. Inflation is a bad thing for an economy. Jackson knew it and had to somehow control this inflation. So he passes what's called Specie Circular. And basically this law that he signed made it so that if you wanted to buy land, you had to use gold, and that's it. No paper money was worthless anymore because of inflation, and nobody had gold. So the amount of land that was changed hands after that went down to nothing, and it caused a caused inflation, which eventually caused a recession, and it went into a deep depression after that. It's called the Panic of 1837. But Andrew Jackson, the effects of this weren't felt until after Andrew Jackson had already left. So you're talking this one man, Andrew Jackson, because of his fiscal policies and just hating the bank and stimulating the economy by putting all the government money into these pet banks, he destroyed the economy. He's depicted here in this cartoon as a king, King Andrew the First. They called him because he was acting like a dictator. Those who opposed him politically were the ones who came up with this political cartoon. So that's how one man destroyed the economy. But he comes out smelling like a rose because he wasn't president anymore, and he leaves a very, I guess you could say, popular president. The results of this Specie Circular: banknotes lose their value, right? Is that they weren't valuable anymore. Land sales plummeted. Credit was no longer available. Businesses began to fail, and it caused the Panic of 1837 after unemployment just went through the roof. So it was a bad time financially for the country. The other thing I want to talk about here with Andrew Jackson is his approach with Native Americans and his philosophy. Andrew Jackson hated Native Americans. He really did. And his goal was to uproot them and move them to the West. And, there were a lot of tribes out there like the Cherokee that were adopting American ways, trying to become like Americans and dressing like Americans and growing crops and whatnot in places like Georgia and Florida. And they were really trying. But Andrew Jackson just wanted to uproot them and send them away onto reservations. And your 5 civilized tribes were located in these areas right here, and they were really trying to be civilized. There was a court case in Georgia. This is, again, involving John Marshall, and here it is, 1832. This guy's still the Chief Justice of the United States. there was the state of Georgia wanted to kick out the Cherokee so they could open up lands for people to settle in. And this got all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled under John Marshall that the Cherokee Indians could stay in Georgia, and Georgia had no right to kick the Indians out. That was what the Worcester versus Georgia said. Well, President Andrew Jackson didn't like that ruling. He wanted to kick the Indians out. And his famous quote was, John Marshall has made his decision, now let's see him enforce it. The thing is, John Marshall's not in charge of enforcing these rulings. It's the president who's in charge of that. And his response to it was the passage of the Indian Removal Act that caused the Trail of Tears. 100,000 Indians were moved out of places like Georgia and Florida and sent to a big Indian reservation in Oklahoma. They sent them out at gunpoint. The military forced them out. Thousands of Indians died along the way due to disease and exposure to the cold and hunger, and they call it the Trail of Tears. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs was in charge of the Indians as they were on these reservations. The BIA is still around today. Here's Seminole in Georgia, the Cherokee. Those Indians were taken from all these areas and sent into this purple area right here, which is Oklahoma, and it became one big Indian reservation because the United States didn't believe Oklahoma's land was worth anything. Well, they kind of find out later that it will be worth something, and then they'll kick the Indians out of their own reservation. So the Indian Removal Act was passed in response to Worcester versus Georgia. All right, we're going to shift gears again and talk about Texas. Texas was owned by Mexico at the time. Now, formerly was owned by Spain, and then Mexico gained their independence from Spain in 1823, and then Texas became part of Mexico. And Texas, being a new independent country in 1823, had a goal, and their goal was for as many people as they possibly can to move into Texas, immigrants moving into Texas. They wanted to become a thriving community and a thriving country, much like the United States they felt was growing to be. And so they were going to accept immigrants coming in. And Stephen Austin, his goal was to leave Missouri and take 300 American families into Texas because they had the opportunity to grow crops, and land was very cheap there. They cut a deal with the government in Mexico City and they said, hey, we'll bring 300 families, and under the agreement that these Texans now had to become Mexican citizens, they had to speak Spanish, and they had to practice Roman Catholicism. And lastly, they had to give up their slaves. Well, the Texans moved in and paid almost nothing for the land and 10 years of tax-free status, and they did none of them. They didn't become Mexican citizens. They didn't speak Spanish. They didn't practice Roman Catholicism. They were Protestant, and they didn't give up their slaves. People that came in, names that you might have heard of: James Bowie, the inventor of the Bowie knife, Davy Crockett, and Stephen Austin. What's going to end up happening is the Texans are going to outnumber the Mexicans by 10-1. And then a dictatorship was established in Mexico led by Santa Anna, the man on the right here. And because of that number switch, there was tension. And because of the fact that Santa Anna wanted to take over that territory and rule it, there's even more tensions. Sam Houston became the president of Texas when they declared their independence in 1836. And he also became the leader of the military. Obviously, Houston, Texas, named after him. There's going to be a battle that goes on in Texas that is indirectly going to involve the United States, but it's indirect. This is going to be fought mostly by Texans who are no longer Americans versus the Mexican government. And the whole battle, the battle culminated. The biggest battle that I'm sure everybody has heard of is the Battle of the Alamo, where the Texans were slaughtered by the Mexican army, they were told to take no prisoners and kill everyone, and they did. They killed everyone. It says here in the Texas Revolution, San Antonio, this is located in San Antonio here, was taken by the Texas Revolutionaries in December of 1835 and was lightly garrisoned. When Mexican General Santa Anna approached with an army of several thousand in February of 1836, only some 150 men held the Alamo. The Texans were there, and some Americans that had come from Louisiana to help them out. And you know, at a certain point, the Mexicans decided to attack, and the Texans had no chance whatsoever. And William Travis and James Bowie and Davy Crockett and some 180 others that were there were killed at the Alamo and slaughtered, and were not allowed to surrender. They were lined up and shot. So there was a lot of atrocities at the Battle of the Alamo, in this battle that was won by the Mexicans. But it's not going to be the end of the war. Shameless self-promotion. There's me years ago in front of the Alamo. Got a chance to go to San Antonio, and of course, anytime I could get a picture at a historical site, you're going to see it. What's kind of cool down there is the Riverwalk in San Antonio, and there's a picture of, they have restaurants, and they have bars and stores and all kinds of things. It's really cool down there. There's a painting right there of what happened at the Alamo. It was just a slaughter. But the Texans were able to somehow capture Santa Anna. They were able to capture him. And because of the way he ran his army, he was in charge and made every single decision. When the leader's not there, no one knew what to do. And the Mexican army was easily defeated by the Texans. And Texas gained their freedom and independence after the Battle of San Jacinto, where they uttered the "Remember the Alamo" there, and were able to win that battle. And Texas was able to gain their independence. Now, Texas is going to immediately ask the United States to become a state, but the United States is not going to want to go there. The reason the United States doesn't want to touch Texas and allow them in is because it would upset the balance between the free and slave states, and it would upset the new country of Mexico, which the United States would rather trade with Mexico than fight a war with them. So you might wonder why the Lone Star on the helmet of the Dallas Cowboys, or the Lone Star on the flag, and it was because Texas was literally its own country from 1836 until 1845. So they were their own country, sitting in between the United States and Mexico. They wanted to become a state, but again, there's going to be a delay. Okay, the creation of the Whig Party, the anti-Jackson Party is also known as. The Whig Party in England is the party that opposes the king, and because of that political cartoon I showed you of Jackson, knowing him as they were starting to call him King Andrew I, they decided to call the Whig Party the party that opposes the king, King Andrew I. So he was a very controversial figure, much like our current president, Trump. There were those people who supported him. There were those people who revered him and loved him, and there were those who hated him, and even his own party. There were Democrats who jumped ship, didn't want to be part of the party anymore because they didn't like Andrew Jackson because he was so controversial. So people like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun formed the Whig Party. It was to allow the Democrats to work alongside the Republicans, the National Republicans, to work alongside the Democrats who jumped ship. So they created this catch-all party known as the Whigs. And it was kind of weird because they had people, all kinds of different beliefs, as you can imagine. There were National Republicans and Democrats who hated Andrew Jackson. So in the election of 1836, Jackson, still a very, very popular president, had a lot of supporters. He picks as his vice president, he picks as his handpicked successor, his vice president, Martin Van Buren. And he told the country, look, if you want things to continue like they are now with me as president, pick my man. I call him MVB, Martin Van Buren. If you pick him, and things are going to go great. And the new Whig Party knew that there's probably no chance they're going to be able to defeat Van Buren because Jackson was so popular. Keep in mind, this is before the Panic of 1837. The public doesn't know how badly Jackson has screwed up the economy yet. But all they knew is that he was a common man's president. So the Whigs tried a little trickery. They throw 3 candidates at Martin Van Buren, hoping that the election gets thrown in the House because the votes would be separated out amongst the 3 candidates and no one would get a majority in the Electoral College. And if they could somehow do that, then they think that there's enough national Republicans and former Democrats in the House of Representatives that they'd be able to win the election. So it was a little trickery there to try to separate the electoral votes, and it didn't work. Martin Van Buren ends up winning the electoral votes, and he was Jackson's handpicked successor, and he will become president. And let's talk a little bit about Jackson's legacy as president. He increased the power of the presidency with his veto power. He was bold and used the veto. He increased the power of the West, right? He was a Westerner. Universal white manhood suffrage. More people were allowed to vote than had ever been before. The caucus was replaced with the nominating convention, so we definitely became more democratic. The common man had more access to land because of the cheap money available from the pet banks. Say what you will about Jackson destroying the economy, but more common man was able to have access to land than ever before. His abuse of the spoil system will one day cause the death of a president. And the fact on the negative, definitely negative side, he single-handedly threw the United States into a depression with his fiscal policies. He was bold and did whatever he wanted to, very similar to a Trump-type president. MVB is the guy that has to take the brunt of the criticism for the economy. He really had nothing to do with the Panic of 1837. It was Jackson's fiscal policies that caused that. But as we are then, now, and then, we tend to blame the guy in charge. So Martin Van Buren takes the brunt of the criticism, and he becomes a one-term president. He did propose what's called the divorce bill. He separated the bank from the government so that no president could have the power that someone like Andrew Jackson had. In the election of 1840, the Democrats are going to renominate Van Buren with not much enthusiasm. The Whigs nominate war hero William Henry Harrison, who for the first time in history, they come up with a slogan. John Tyler was his running mate, and William Henry Harrison was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, so they called him Tippecanoe, and the slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too in 1840. And William Henry Harrison is going to be elected president. Harrison was from Virginia, and it was a kind of a, here's some, I'll tell you about those pictures later, but William Henry Harrison is going to have the distinction of having the shortest presidency in American history. He's going to last less than a month when he dies of pneumonia. And Tyler, too, will become president. But we'll talk about that more in the next chapter. And that concludes this chapter.